realizing that, in teaching that, it allows, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, the Black community to feel like anything is possible, and teaching that to the children so that they can then act in accordance to strive for greatness.
Yeah, I mean, we often say, like, you can't be what you don't see. And you have two things here happening, right? One is there are no examples being taught in mainstream institutions or school and or on the media about the success of Black and brown people. So that's a detriment to everybody. That's a detriment to white people not knowing what's possible. That's a detriment to Black people not knowing what's possible. Then on top of that, for those who are taught at home or taught in their community or taught in their churches and saying, well, no, I don't believe that. I know that I could do this. The level to get ahead, the race is so scattered with nails and thorns and difficulty and ropes in your way and oil slicks. But what it takes to be a successful, alive Black bus driver, as an example, that man could easily probably be the governor of his state, right? Like, for us to be able to get to make $1 single million, which is not a lot of money, it's a lot of work and convincing and still fighting and explaining why you're there and justifying yourself over and over and over again with a lack of information and a dearth of support. I think that's the part that, again, is hard to contemplate if you're not living it. And I think Black people have been penalized in the past for raising it. So we suffer in community silence and try to chip things away, a centimeter at a time. And it's not working for anybody involved. And it's to the economic detriment of this country to not capitalize on the genius that exists within Black and brown communities. There is no zip code that has a lock on genius, but to unlock it, right, you have to put the proper tools in place, the proper resources and the level of education that we just discussed. And then they have to be able to get alone with that information and have the appropriate amount of support and get an interview, right? And actually be brought in the conversation at the table. Even those who have the best of intentions, if you are trying to solve problems for the people who have the problems and the problem holders are not invited to the solution party, then we are going in a circle that is ineffective and will not produce the results that anybody's seeking, even if there's a confluence of good intentions.
I'm glad that you really said that, because that really brings to this episode, this discussion, in that, like, I really don't know how to handle it. This is all very new to me, and I'm very open and willing to be coached, to be taught, to learn. But it's super freaking uncomfortable, right? Because it's like, at the end of the day, it is not an experience I have personally had. And so I am trying to be open and understand and hear, and then say, it, like you said, this isn't just a Black person's problem. We need to talk about the realities. I need to be, like I said, educated on it, of the realities, because it's not a life that I have necessarily lived. So I don't expect this conversation to then be like, okay, it's all great, and now we're good to go, right? Education is just a small fraction of then seeing it all the way through to taking the action and seeing the results. And even something that I'd said earlier, I want to bring up. So I'd given the reference to the test with the Asian girls. Yeah. And so even that comes back down to implicit biasness, right? Is because, implicit bias is, well, Asians are smart, women are less smart, right? Sometimes that bias can really serve you, right? So it's like, if you're Asian and the bias is that Asians are smart at maths, and then they're reminded of that, it can seriously serve them in incredible ways. But of course, as we've seen, it can also be a massive detriment. So talking about kind of like the education part of it and the biasness, and then seeing how we can somehow turn it around. And so I see this as such a long-term play and a long-term issue that we're having to deal with. What do you think are certain steps that we can do apart from education, apart from these conversations, that we can maybe start taking action, whether it's from an individual level or a governmental level?
We're out of time, right? So I think, unfortunately, the reality is, and I see your point, and you and I have talked about this before, right? I've read it, and I'm sure you've read it, that it takes literally 100,000 years to make a significant change to your brain's kind of neural pathways in terms of evolution. It's not easy to completely change your habits, but it is 1,000% possible. And you can see we are not there yet, as an example, with what has gone on in women's rights in the last 5 years. But I think what has happened in the last 5 years is more than has happened in the last 20 years. So I think when we think about what will happen for Black Americans, we just cannot wait and we cannot accept it. So that will require, I think, dramatic responses in order to get dramatic action. And it will also require an audacity of thought and approach. And the severity of what has occurred has to be commensurate with the response. Is it similar to what the GI Bill did for veterans and is still doing in the last 10 years, where it is a significant and wide sweeping legislation to address the gap? Is it things like, well, actually, there are cities where you have Black people essentially through taxes paying for their persecution. On the flip side of that, if a police officer is actually given a civil award, taxpayers are paying for that. So if you're a Black taxpayer, you're paying for your persecution and you pay for the penalty. That makes no sense at all. You may have to go to cities and say, hey, city, you owe Black Americans back taxes for the last 50 years, this percentage allocation. Like, we will need some dramatic responses, I think, in order to have real change. And as you know, and I think I've heard you speak about this eloquently, is sometimes the practice of your behaviors have to speed ahead of your mind, and you have to do it in reverse. And then we've talked about kind of like the power of posing, and forget the wonderful woman's name, I think Amy McCuddy, whatever, has done a lot of work on this, where you can trick your body by doing certain things. And if you pretend to be asleep, sometimes your body will fall asleep. Or if you pose in a confident way, sometimes your mind will follow. We will have to behave in the way that we expect, and our mind may not catch up for a century, but I think the behaviors cannot be tolerated anymore. We are plumb out of time.
Yeah, that's so true. And I really do hope that you're right, that it doesn't take as long to unwind. And I think it really does. Not even unwind. That's actually the wrong word. I need to catch myself for doing that. It's actually not unwind. It's getting to a place that we've never been, that we should be at. Yeah. Yes. So, like I go back to the Einstein quote, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing and expecting a different result. So if we actually want to expect a different result, then we have to change our behavior. And so to change our behavior means, I think, that we have to come together. So do you have any thoughts on how we do that?
Yeah, I'm on I work with an organization called Thread in Baltimore, and it's run by a brilliant woman who's a neuroscientist. And it is really quite literally about how the threads of society are inextricable. And you can't, if you think like, well, I'm going to sit in this neighborhood and what happens over there doesn't happen to me, it is a ludicrous proposition, and it's not something that's sustainable. We are all inextricably connected, as we can see with what's happening with climate change and the racial divide, and we can go on and on, right? It will eventually end up on your doorstep. So how can we be proactive about moving ahead? So my dad said to me that once garages became mainstream in America, it was one of the things that contributed to a lack of community and a lack of conversation, because you were not forced to speak to your neighbors on the block kind of when you went out. You could just go straight into your home without ever having to speak to anyone. And that is something that Thread kind of represents. And I'm, forgive my long-winded way of getting to the answer, that the organization focuses on kids that have literally like 0.025 GPAs, and we surround them with a family of volunteers, to like about 5 to 10 people who stick with that kid for 10 years. We actually modeled it like on gangs. And essentially we do absolutely whatever it takes, help them with their homework, pick them, take them to school. If God forbid they get arrested, help them navigate the criminal justice system, help them get an employment. And these kids go from the likelihood of graduating being less than 5% to over 90% high school graduation rates. And high school graduation is one of the biggest indicators of like later success, more money in life, right? The way that it works, and our real goal, is to desegregate Baltimore. Because if you get to 7 to 9% of the population of Baltimore, you start to get to a point and you can actually have a tipping point where everyone knows each other. Baltimore is a great city as an example because the segregation there is pre-civil rights levels in terms of where people live. And there are people in East Baltimore who will live their whole lives and never go to West Baltimore, and the converse is true. And I say that to say, I think that is symbolic of what's happening across the country, in that we have become so singular and so insular that at a time when information is at its greatest, connection is at its lowest. And how can you have empathy for somebody you don't know. If you have never been to a Black person's house, if you've never been to a white person's house, there is, I don't see how you start to have any level of love or empathy or sympathy for how we're jointly connected when you don't have to do anything but look at a screen. So I do think it is incredibly important that you figure out how to have better, true community. And again, sometimes I'm not opposed to sometimes forcing the behaviors to lead the activity. Like, how do you ensure that there's real interaction? One of the things with police specifically is there's a school of thought about why community policing works so well is when the police live in the community and they know, oh, little Johnny has ADHD, so we're going to treat him a little bit differently. Or I know his mother, so instead of me, handling this way, I'm going to call his mom. Or I'm not going to be beating people that I'm going to see at the supermarket or when we all go to Johnny's for dinner on time. I can't do it. I live here. I actually know these people. And I think the fact that we no longer have a connection where you know your fireman, where your grandmother lives 5 blocks, has actually been to our detriment. And I love traveling as much as the next person. I love the fact that we can be a mobile society to learn as much as we can for each other. But the disconnected community, I think, is crippling us in the way we interact, in the lack of civility, and even the way people communicate with you. No, the way people communicate on social media would never have occurred to this degree, this intensity in the town square, right? But people feel so free when they have when they can be anonymous behind a screen. So I think that's incredibly important. That said, extreme times do call for extreme measures. And when communities are disenfranchised and abused over and over again, they are not going to continue to take it. And I'm not desirous to see deep levels of violence on either side, but it's a situation where I feel this community is responding in self-defense. I feel that the response is not even requited to what has happened. And I hope, and God forbid, that we ever get to a point that it is in fact commensurate, which I think everybody is trying to avoid.
Yeah,